Well, I'm third generation pastor, so I'm blessed to be able to grow up in a Christian home. And most of our stories is not that simple. We had kind of our own struggles. My mom and dad got divorced early, and even though my dad was a minister, that left a huge impression on me. So I think growing up without a father made me really sensitive. A father in the home made me really sensitive to the need for that. So, but I was blessed to be able to have a good relationship, both my mom and my dad. Grew up in the suburbs of Detroit after my mom felt like it was a little bit too dangerous for my brother and I to stay in the city proper, but was blessed to be able to grow up in a home that really loved the Lord and loved learning. So I come from a background of educators. My dad was a history professor and teacher for 27 years. So I grew up around a whole lot of books where summer fun was helping Dad organize his library and read books. We called it torture, but he called it fun, and it really stuck with us. So early on, I had a real love for not only theology, but my dad sat for the California bar, and so he had a lot of law books. So a love for law, a love for theology. Later on, a love for economics and finance. And really tried to spend my life figuring out a way to fuse those things together. I come from a big family, so I have two other brothers and I have four sisters. So it's a pretty cool, pretty neat family. But after the divorce, I grew up with just one brother. Me and my older brother stayed with my mom, and but it was great. Maintained a great relationship with my siblings, and we're close to today. So that was kind of the background story. But let me just say one other thing, and that is youth ministry. It just changed my life. My mother got me enrolled in a Christian school, and we started attending the church, Evangel Ministries in Detroit, where I am now pastoring. I'm kind of a homegrown story, but I came to Christ in the youth ministry. And it was so important for my development to have that core group of friends who really encouraged my faith. And all of us just about that were in that generation of youth ministry went on to serve the Lord. I had a very significant turning point in my life where my mom was unfortunately in a car accident, and they had said she would be a vegetable for the rest of her life. The good thing is that she's recovered and she's doing well. But during that time, my youth pastor pretty much took me in altogether, and was living out of his refrigerator, sleeping at his house a lot, and developed a real love for ministry, not just from an intellectual side that I got from my dad, a lot of reading, but from the actual serving side. And so my youth ministry just had us out in streets of Detroit, serving the homeless, going to youth homes, doing a lot of evangelistic ministry. And so it left a huge impression on me. And it was around that time that he asked me if I'd like to do some Bible studies, lead some Bible studies in our youth ministry. And I said yes, and got the ministry bug and never turned back. We actually at one point had three locations. We spun off the other locations into independent churches, but we've definitely gone through some growth over the last 10 years. We were probably about 1,000 members when I had the privilege of taking over in 2004 as a senior pastor. So we have experienced a lot of growth, and predominantly most of that growth in a good way has come from our commitment to evangelism, apologetics, engaging the culture. We do a lot of ministry on college campuses in our area. We do this event called Answering the Challenge, where we invite the community in to discuss kind of these provocative topics to get the conversation going. And I think most people are used to coming to church and being lectured to and not being a part of the conversation. So we really want to change that culture, and I think that's really been rewarding and fruitful for the ministry. But the church has a really good long history of living up to its name, Evangel Ministries. And so we've always been very much outreach oriented, even my predecessor. So I'm the second pastor in the history of the church, and it's going well. It's a great ministry. Yeah, it was. I was 26, when I was asked to take on the lead pastor role. It was scary on the one hand because you're young, but I felt very supported, and I was surrounded by a lot of ministry veterans, and we've always been a multi-generational church. So though we have a lot of emerging leaders, we've also had folks who were older, and I still don't understand why they follow my leadership, but folks who were older who I think saw the value in staying around, being a stable force, and making sure the ministry went well. And so the transition, I couldn't have written a better script. The founding pastor and I have a lot of respect for one another. So I think we tried to honor each other, really well. So there wasn't this major rift or fall off or tension at all. So that's been really cool. But yeah, I think as a young leader, you're always nervous. And, I think for the first 4 years, my big fear was, oh Lord, don't let the ministry go insolvent on my watch. Don't let me be the one that ruins the whole thing, But God gives a lot of grace. And looking back on it, what I realized is that He is far more faithful to the things He calls us to than we are. So even when we're ill-equipped, if He is really in the calling, He provides grace and mercy. It's to trust God, to know that the God who called you will supply what you need, to listen to wisdom, to not feel the pressure to have, when you're young and you're in a leadership role, a senior leadership role, you kind of feel this pressure to have all the answers. Because if I don't, then it shows a chink in my armor, and then people will question whether or not I'm qualified to lead. And I think that people understand that it's a developmental process. So just kind of to relax and, just trust that God will get you to the destination. And then I think the other thing I would say to myself is, don't forget why you got into this. There's a lot of distractions, but remember, you got into this because you felt a call from God to reach people with the gospel and to help people fall in love with Christ. And in any ministry, and I'm sure Dr. Noble could attest to this as well, in any ministry you got the pressures of running the ministry, what I call the machine. So the fundraising, meeting with donors, trying to get buildings and operations and administration, and that type of stuff can drain your ministry passion real quick. So you have to make sure the bulk of your energy, you need to do some of that stuff, but the bulk of your energy needs to go into sharing the gospel and helping people grow in their knowledge and love of Jesus. And hopefully, if you're blessed, surround yourself with people who are called to the administrative stuff that can do it far better than you can. It's quite a journey. Well, actually, it's not that hard to understand when you know the city context that you're in. Being in Detroit, there's two major needs. There's always the economic empowerment need, and then there's the need for Christ, the need for salvation and spiritual renewal. And so the truth of the matter is that leaders that are effective in your urban inner city context in major metropolitan areas, often have this kind of duality as far as their personality. You're not allowed the privilege of just being a theologian. You have to be well versed in community development, economic development. And so I think my story is probably far more typical for the average pastor in my area. Truth of the matter is for the ministries in the cities that really have been hard hit economically, most of the thriving churches have pastors who have some type of business or community development background. And so I did, as I mentioned earlier, have a huge love for finance, and it was predominantly because of my parents. When I graduated from college, I realized that mom and dad had put all their money into sending me and my brother to school, that they had delayed their savings for retirement, totally. And so it was really trying to help them figure out, and graduating from college with a degree in finance, they kind of figured I knew what to advise them, and I said, well, I better, find out. And that just kind of set me on a course of really getting pretty much falling in love with the markets and how investing worked, and the power of helping people to leave a multi-generational legacy. And you run into verses like Proverbs 13:22, that a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And so while I was at Morgan Stanley, the bulk of my time was doing financial education, for our community and a lot of one-on-one financial planning. And it's really like pastoral work, because money is never about money. Money is always about choices and values and decisions and mistakes and the need for grace. And so it was a pretty easy transition. But maybe the linchpin in it is that my senior pastor at the time was one of my clients. And so it was through that relationship that he saw my pastoral heart as well. So he saw my work with the youth ministry, saw my proclivity for finance. And he said, I think that those qualities could really work well in a pastoral role. So I went from there to being a pastor, and we launched at our church a Bible Institute that became pretty successful. About 700 people came through our Bible Institute, which was a 1-year kind of seminary prep program. In about 6 years, we had about 700 people. And so Moody heard about it and called and said, would you be willing to oversee our graduate schools? Well, I think most of the shift in the higher education field is return on investment. Everybody's talking about that. What type of return on investment are you getting from schools? I think that with the advent of for-profit schools, which brought a lot of good innovation to the industry, and online education, you do have an oversaturation, and it does kind of maybe water down the value. What people have to do in this generation is to make sure whatever school they choose gives them a great return on investment. That includes a great high quality education, but also post-placement into the field of your choice. What I will say for the African American and Latino communities is that we're not at an oversaturation point yet, and we still need a huge investment into getting high schoolers to, number one, have a great high school education, but then number two, being able to get into really solid baccalaureate programs so they can go on and not only earn great livings, but I think an educated individual is the greatest weapon against ignorance and against really the work of the enemy in our communities. Yeah, I'm really concerned about the level of theological education in our generation, in two ways, two fronts. Number one, it's becoming far more liberal. As you know, a lot of colleges are going from having theology departments to religion departments. And there's a big difference between theology, which is the study of God, His scriptures, the major tenets of the Bible, to religion in general, which really is the study of man and how we kind of, from a epistemological perspective, have wrestled with this whole concept of God. And so I think that we need a major renewal and revival to the focus of theological study being on God and not on man primarily. But on the other end of the spectrum, even for those schools that have remained faithful to producing really solid Bible expositors and communicators of the gospel, I think that we have unfortunately lost the fluid conversation with the local church. And seminaries, Bible colleges ultimately end up hurting themselves if we're kind of doing our own thing off in left field, disconnected from the local church. There needs to be a continued fluid conversation between the local church and saying, what are you facing on the front lines of ministry in this culture? And this is why I believe that more schools need to have apologetic departments, do more worldview training, because sending someone out into this culture and all they know how to do, and I don't want to minimize this, but all they know how to do is translate the text into Greek and to do sentence structuring and great exegetical work, but they don't know how to communicate to the hurting heart and the needs of this generation. The heart cry of their community is actually setting them up for failure. And so I'm concerned, but being around ministries like Summit, being in the field that I'm in apologetics, is really encouraging to see some bastions of hope around the country. Through John Stone Street, actually. I was blessed to meet this weird guy named John Stone Street. But John, as we know, is one of the great thinkers and communicators in our generation. And John and I connected through his work with Wilberforce Weekend and with the Colson Center. And, we just begin to talk about what it takes to really communicate the gospel effectively into our various contexts of ministry. And I think he was intrigued about my story and where I do ministry at. I was intrigued about his as well. And it really has just allowed us to have a great relationship. And one of the things that's really interesting about John Stone Street is that he's one of those rare individuals that you can talk to about literally anything. There's not like an area subject. I'm still trying to find the subject that he doesn't have some sense of insightfulness into. But in the course of our relationship, he said, I really want to introduce you to Dr. Jeff. I don't know how many people know that Dr. Jeff is from Detroit. He's from the Detroit area. Was born there, spent the first 10 years of his life, the best 10 years of his life there in Detroit, Michigan. And so getting a chance to meet Dr. Jeff and hearing his love for this generation just is infectious. And so I was invited to come out to my first summit a couple of years ago, and I came, and you instantly fall in love with not only the setting, not only the mission, but the actual kids, the participants in the program. And so it's been great. Well, I think Detroit, so it's the tale of two cities, right? It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. Detroit is a very inspiring city. It's Motown, it's creativity. There's a lot of drive. There's a lot of innovation. I tell people all the time, we were a city who once moved the world, and that's still in our DNA. I mean, we made cars that moved the nation and the globe. And so I don't know if you can find too many places that has as much drive and as much innovation as Detroit. But the other part of it to me is the history of the church. The church has always run into hurting cities. When you think about the fall of Rome, you think about the Black Plague, we were the ones running into failing cities, not running away from them. And I think the problem with the 21st century American church is when it comes to cities like Newark, New Jersey, when it comes to cities like Gary, Indiana, even now Chicago, seeing the violence there, what you see often, unfortunately, in places even like Camden, New Jersey and Detroit, is the church bails. We move to safer, greener pastures, And I just kind of feel like, no, we need to have a witness there. We need to show that God can do his great work, his greatest work in broken places. So I think the brokenness attracts me. And the thing about Detroit is that it's to the point now where if you're in Detroit, it's because you feel called there. You're not there because of any shallow reasons. You're not moving there for the weather. Definitely not moving there for the economy. So if you're there, you're there because you really feel this commitment to urban renewal. And so just about everywhere you turn, you're bumping into people who really feel a call to see the city revitalized, to see if what we can test in this lab is, able to be exported to other cities. You find that when you're doing ministry in Detroit, there's a great love for other cities as well. So it's just a really inspiring place. And, I tell people all the time I was born there, baptized there, married there, met my wife there, lost friends there, experienced, the death of loved ones there. I mean, so when your heart is so buried into one city, it's really easy to love. So that's a short answer. So first piece of advice would be study philosophy. I think that having a strong philosophical foundation is hugely important. Second, know what you're defending. Oftentimes we don't have a strong theological training, and you don't really need to have a strong theological training, unfortunately, to go into apologetics full time, which is a sad thing. So you should spend the first season of your life really knowing our faith well, knowing the Christian worldview well, so that you can know exactly what you're defending. So start with the text, start with philosophy, and then thirdly, build relationships with people who don't believe like you believe. If the bulk of your time is spent with fans of Christianity, you kind of get a warped view of the world. My wife and I were talking yesterday about people that we know in our lives that believe differently, radically differently than we do, that aren't evil or monstrous. They just are everyday people in a way having the same type of desires we do for peaceful lives, for prosperity, for freedom, but yet believing a worldview that ultimately undermines that. So I think that shapes the way you address people. So be careful not to just spend your time around individuals who are snipers in the Christian faith, looking for blood on their sword as a definition of victory. But look for compassionate people who can communicate and relate to non-Christians well. So that would be my top 3 pieces of advice. Against pride, there's an enormous amount of pride in the Christian faith. And I don't think we even realize how much pride we have. And a lot of that pride is a carryover from how much influence we have had historically in the American culture. To secondly, know that the honeymoon of Christianity in America is over. So just understand you're going out into a world that is not your friend. And so be cautious about that. And then finally, I would just caution them against the definition of victory being that you win every debate. I think the definition of victory is staying in the conversation. And sometimes you will go home with your head between your tails, licking your wounds because somebody just maybe beat you up intellectually. But those moments, I find for me, have been the most motivating moments for study, for growth. Anytime I've been humbled in a debate or an argument or a conversation with someone, I've gone back and really deepened my commitment to study. So, but just make sure you stay committed to staying in the conversation. There's one quote from the life of Mother Teresa where she was interviewed from someone from the New York Times. And they were asking and really challenging her time in Calcutta, India. And they said, don't you feel like a failure? You've been here for over a decade and still as much AIDS and sickness as when you came. Don't you feel like you're not successful? And her response is, God hasn't called me to be successful. He's called me to be faithful. And I think we need to make sure we embrace that type of wisdom. We're called to be faithful till he returns and leave the results to him. Going back to my top 3 advice of things to do, I would say start with a good systematic theology. I love Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, but there's many that are out there, so I would start with a really good systematic theology. I think that William Lane Craig's materials really help to lay a philosophical foundation for apologetics. So A Reasonable Faith will be another great book to read. And then I think that you should always try to read books from the ancients, from the past. I think that someone who really wants to understand the history of the Christian church should have a strong church history book. Mark Knowles' book, Turning Points, is a great book for that. But you want to make sure that you're reading the historical account of the Christian faith. And I would throw in there Calvin's Institutes, because he does such a great job at elucidating the Christian faith. If I could just add one more, and that's the Westminster Confession. Kind of giving away my reform bent, but I just think that being able to think through, I think we need to be able to answer questions. And what I love about catechism is that it is shaped in a Q&A type of format. And that's how I teach my kids to faith, is to ask them questions. And hey, what do you think about God and his creation? And start a conversation that way. I love Tertullian. He was very innovative. We get so many concepts about the faith from him. Even the way we articulate the Trinity to this day is because of him. And so I have an encyclopedia of the Church Fathers, which has really helped me. And, it's kind of a cross-reference where you're able to, by topic, look up major quotes from them. My least favorite is Origen. But I love, even though at a certain point in his life, Tertullian did get off into maybe some things that are questionable, he does such a great job of being able to help Christians to think innovatively about how do we articulate our faith in terms that are understandable. His whole goal was to articulate the Christian faith in ways that people could understand it and convey it to others. Because what good is it if we have knowledge that we can't communicate effectively? Yeah, the sad thing about Dr. King is that his legacy has been wrapped up in his speeches, his most famous speeches, which are phenomenal. I mean, off the charts. I still get goosebumps when I hear "I Have a Dream" speech. partly because it reminds me of my dad. But a couple of his books, The Measure of a Man is a great book. He preached at a Christian Ed conference for the United Church of Christ two messages: the dimension of a man's life and what is man, and they convinced him to combine it into a book. So The Measure of the Man is a great book. My favorite book of Dr. King's is Strength to Love. He writes so powerfully about how to love your enemy, and then Letters from a Birmingham Jail. Obviously that is an epistle for our day. So I would say that's a great place to get his thought. And what was amazing about Dr. King is you think about the audience he was preaching to. So primarily undereducated, majority poor African Americans, and he's bringing in Aristotle and Plato and Athanasius and Augustine and all of these things, and he's just speaking as if they know. You remember Plato when he said this, and what he was doing in a way that was not condescending at all is raising the level of the conversation. And I think it was probably the heyday of African American preaching. It was a time when you brought your brain to church, and my hope is that me and others who are called to that context will carry on that legacy. Definitely. So in our day, you have men like Dr. Anthony Bradley, who teaches at the King's College, who is a great thinker and writer. You also have Carl Ellis Jr., who's down at Reformed Theological Seminary, and he's a great thinker and writer as well. Dr. Thabiti Anyabwile, and he is preaching in the Grand Cayman Islands, but he has a blog called The Front Porch, and he does a great job with that. And then finally, I think from an economic side of things, Dr. Thomas Sewell, and Dr. Walter Williams, they write very well on race and economics, and I think that's a very important topic for our community. So you have your two extremes. You have your domination approach, let's dominate, let's conquer in his name. Then you have your assimilation approach, where we just want to assimilate a culture and not fight. And I think that what we have to do is to remain prophetic in our relationships with the political parties. Remember that our job is to remind them of the high calling and the virtue and the vision set out by the founders for our country. And so we shouldn't allow the church to be an extension of the political wings of either party. Now, what we have to do is to see clearly what the Bible teaches about every subject in life, including the way we should be governed and the way economy should run, and we should espouse our own vision and own view. I think that why we've become so political is quite honestly because we have lost our innovation and we've lost our prophetic voice. We should be introducing new lines of thinking into the conversation instead of just trying to parrot what other individuals are communicating. And again, I think that once we accept the fact that the heyday of Christianity in America is behind us and accept that that's okay, then we stop trying to be politicians and just try to communicate effectively. Now, to the extent that politicians find agreement with the Bible, I think we can support them when they find agreement with the Christian worldview, and that's regardless of party. And one of the things that we need to make sure we kind of speak against is lock, stock, and barrel, us kind of taking a voting position of, one party straight ticket. I just think if Jesus was to vote, he'd probably be a little bit more selective and a little bit more nuanced than that. So we need to look at individuals and understand that if we do have a relationship with politicians, it's to disciple them and to help them to understand the gospel and how it translates into the world we live in. Well, I think that unfortunately theology and apologetics have been trapped in the prison of academia. So it's just kind of been seen as a educational endeavor. And so for the masses of people who either feel boxed out of the educational arena or don't feel an affinity to the classroom, they are missing out on some rich theological discussions and conversations. And what I love is the generation that we have now that has emerged and knowing how to translate epistles into movies, learning how to translate theology into spoken word, doctrine into hip hop. Those types of things I think really unlock and unleash the power of Christian thought and put it into the hands of the common man. And isn't that kind of the spirit of the Reformation? Is how do we take the truths of the Christian faith and put it into the hands of the common man? And so I think we are living up to our ancestry whenever we say, how do we make this more accessible, more local, more common? And so that's where I get the kind of soulful sense. The other part of it is being from an ethnic minority group and knowing the demographic trends that America is headed for. We are going to become a majority minority country. And so when you talk about those groups, I think being able to communicate the static truths of the gospel in a culturally sensitive way is important as well. When you come into the Black church, the rhythm and the style of the preaching is just as important as the content, and there's a cadence. There's a desire to reach and stir the heart while reaching the mind as well, and we got to keep that in balance. But that's not a bad thing. It's just a reality of reaching people. God made a diverse group of humanity, and we need to be sensitive to that in the church. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there needs to be more working together, so there should be cooperation in mission and outreach. But I think that if we're committed to reaching our communities, then every church should be a reflection of the demographics of its community. So if I'm in a city that's 95% Black and I am reaching that community effectively, I shouldn't be surprised if the congregational racial mix reflects that, right? Same way, if I'm in a community that's 95% white, that's going to be the case. Now, if you're in a community where there is diversity, but yet people don't want to commingle with one another, that is a problem. So you should strive to make sure, are we seeing a reflection in our leadership that really matches the demographics? For example, being in Detroit, we also have a large Arab population in a city called Dearborn, right outside Detroit. So one of the things we've tried to work on is having Middle Eastern leadership or influence in our church. That's a reflection of us trying to reach that community and that segment of population. But there is still a huge amount of residue from the racial tensions in this country, and the church has to continue to chip away at it. And the best way to do that is for leaders to sit across the table with a cup of coffee in their hand, building relationships, true intimacy. But it can't be done just through ceremony and through services that are here one day and go on the next. It has to be genuine relationship. Yeah, I think that preaching has been given to us according to Romans. How can they hear? How can they be saved unless they hear someone preach? And so the reality is that preaching is the vehicle that God has given to us. But I think the way that we communicate, especially in the matter of length of time, the days of the hour and a half long sermon, I think are really behind us. It's really tough. So we have to find a way to get really potent, high concentrated truth into small amounts of time if we want them to be able to process. That's the downside of technology. It does undermine attention spans, mine, yours, and everyone else's. But I do think that the greatest impact that technology has is on the way we do discipleship, the methodology of discipleship. And being able to reach people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is a privilege, but it also creates a new demand. And so I say, yes, we continue to preach, but we need to make everything that we do accessible in the formats that people are trying to connect with us on. And I think we need to make sure we do it in sound bites that allow them to hopefully get a lot of great content in a smaller amount of time, which is tough for someone who's long-winded like me. I don't know if I'll survive, but Well, I don't think that they're necessarily in conflict with one another. I just think that it's how you utilize the time you have. So it's important to say if I have 45 minutes, if I know that studies are telling me that the attention span of the average adult is about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, I need to make sure that I am coming in with a game plan that kind of hits the ground and accomplishes the purposes that I want to accomplish, and hopefully sets them up to carry the ball further. I think we also put a lot of pressure on the Sunday morning service. The Sunday morning service is not the end-all be-all of Christian discipleship. It's one moment in the week. It's a great moment. It's a celebratory moment. But any military has a great air attack and a great ground attack. If you study Nehemiah, you find that they preached. Nehemiah and Ezra preached, but they also got with the people in small groups and helped them to understand application. I think we're in a day and age where we need to return back to that type of model, that we have great Sunday celebrations, but the ground attack is throughout the week in small groups and in discipleship, Bible studies, and one-on-one relationships. That's where the battle is won. And the one thing about smartphones and social media is that it has created a huge desire and vacuum for true intimacy. It's lacking and it's needed. And I think this is what the church offers, a place where you can come and be a part of a family. And if we capitalize on the hunger for intimacy, I think the church will have a great future in the 21st century. Yeah, we do. And I think that you get into one of the great difficulties of the word urban is that it can be defined in multiple ways. So there's one way of defining urban which has to do a lot with density. So our communities where there is culture, there's a lot of people, there is creativity, these urban centers as opposed to the majority rural America, which we often see as not being the place where philosophical thought or culture is really being created and made. And so I think these culture makers need to be reached. The artist, the kind of innovative thinkers in business and stuff. This is where you get the hipster movement. But I also think the other way of defining urban is where you see diversity. So diversity and density coming together is what I try to address in the book. But diversity, in particular racial or ethnic diversity, is a big part of the urban definition for me. And so being a part of apologetics now for over a decade, recognizing that there's very few pieces of literature that's out there that are answering the questions that the ethnic diverse communities of our nation are asking really concern me, because it doesn't make a difference if you answer the wrong question the right way. If you answer the wrong question the right way, you still have not made a convert. So I can spend all day long elucidating about the failed worldview of the Mormon church, right? But in the black community, we are not concerned about the Mormon church at all, right? That's just not at the forefront of our concern, right? Not just not important in broader culture. But in our community, we are desperately concerned about social justice issues. We're really concerned about the Nation of Islam. We're really concerned about movements that are nationalistic in a black nationalism perspective. And so these questions have to be answered effectively. And so my contribution in urban apologetics is to say, hey, there's this whole audience out here that's screaming for answers to questions that are unique to them, and we need to make sure we give them a voice and that we answer those questions. And I think that biblical transmission is huge. I think that one of the things that we have really failed to do really well in the local church is undertake the whole topic of biblical criticism. And so that is a horrible thing, because when Christians leave our churches and engage with somebody who has been pretty well versed in biblical criticism from a secular perspective, they're like totally frightened out of their pants, like, man, where did this come from? And what's great about the Christian tradition is that biblical criticism has been something that we fully embrace. Thus the footnotes at the bottom of your Bibles, they kind of discuss the debate with the kind of in-house family debate over certain passages of scripture or the text as a whole. So I think we need to do a better job at being able to introduce biblical criticism. And from Bruce Metzger, the work that he did at Princeton, all the way up to Daniel Wallace and what he's doing now at DTS. I think we need to have more of a conversation like that so that Christians won't be intimidated by, oh no, how do I really interpret 1 John chapter 5? Is that really there? Or what do I do about the longer ending of Mark? Helping Christians to say, okay, let's defang this. Don't be intimidated. The Bible you have is still reliable, trustworthy, but these are some things you need to be aware of. Yeah, so I'm really big into the science of the mind, the study of the brain, kind of biological evolution, because what we're seeing from people like Michael Ruse and others, especially those out of Harvard, I've just spent a couple weeks at Harvard, that there is a major push to try to show that ethics and morality is just a function of evolution and the development of the mind, and there's so much need and thought there. I think that we need more Christian in the hard sciences, and we're seeing a move and a thrust towards that. I also think that we need Christians in the area of economics, because that's such a huge field that governs so much of our lives. And so if I'm an apologist, what I'm doing and what I'm encouraging young budding apologists to do is to pick a field of study that has nothing to do with theology, and to dedicate your life to infusing theological thought into that field of study. I think that's the best thing we can do for the world. And if we look at our predecessors, generations gone by, what they did is they took up all of these diverse studies in the world, from the kind of soft sciences, the humanities, if you will, to the hard sciences, and said, how do I approach this Christianly? How do I take Christian thought and apply it here? And so there's great work being done by Stephen Myers and individuals that are looking at the dynamics of the cell. I just think that the conversations that are not being had in the local church has to do with the brain, its development, and the hard science of our physical development.